Hello, everybody. Good morning for people in Tokyo. Good evening for everybody in New York. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. I'm Alicia Ogawa. I am director of the project on Japanese corporate governance and stewardship. And at each of these webinars, I always begin by saying that the point of our project is not simply to track developments in Japan, but to examine what's going on in the US, the UK, the EU, in order to compare and contrast to see what we can learn from the best practices in each jurisdiction. And tonight's focus is exactly on that. We're here to discuss how two countries, which are on opposite extremes of the stakeholder-shareholder axis, need to come closer to the middle, and what they might borrow from each other in order to make that happen. Japan has long been criticized, recently sometimes praised, for the emphasis that they put on stakeholders, such as customers and employees, instead of shareholders. America, by contrast, is characterized as the greediest of capitalist systems, with companies seemingly existing only for the benefit of their shareholders and their overpaid CEOs. I'm currently writing a piece on this contrast as represented by Hitachi on the one hand and GE on the other hand. In spite of the astronomical salaries of Jack Welch and Jeff Immelt at GE, in spite of Welch's self-congratulatory autobiography and the worship of him as a manager, Hitachi actually comes out well ahead of GE since the financial crisis, not only in terms of shareholder return, but in terms of returns to the workforce and the community at large. But there are plenty of US companies who have rewarded their investors with outstanding returns by treating their employees well. A London Business School paper from 2011 found that the companies who consistently made the annual list of the top 10 companies to work for in America earned investment returns substantially greater than their peer group. So I'd like to suggest that in spite of living in a system that favors shareholders, American companies can still develop their own strategies that reward investors by looking beyond them to other stakeholders. And the same can be said about Japan. There are plenty of companies who reward shareholders well inside a system that doesn't necessarily incentivize that. So we need to take a close look at both cases and encourage their peers to exchange these kinds of practices. So turning to tonight's discussion, with the publication of the Corporate Governance Code in Japan in 2015, almost immediately, Japan began this rediscovery of a chapter in its own history called Sampo Yoshi. Sampo Yoshi is a philosophy developed by the merchants in the Edo and Meiji eras of Japan. It means three-way satisfaction, meaning that the benefits of business should be shared among the seller, the buyer, and the local community. It's very similar to what is now called in the West the double bottom line or the triple bottom line concept. Now, I lived in Japan from the mid-80s until 2000, and I never heard any mention of Sampo Yoshi either in business discussions, nor did I ever come across it in any bookstore. So I'm very interested to learn from our speakers tonight about what's behind the recent spotlight on Sampo Yoshi. Is it simply an attempt to justify the tendency of old-style Japanese companies to ignore shareholders as much as possible? Or is it, as Sarah Lubman has suggested to me, that the three constituencies in Sampo Yoshi have changed? For one thing, they now include groups outside of Japan. And I understand that Annamarie has recently been involved in a documentary about Sampo Yoshi, so I'm sure she can speak to the rise of the interest in this history. Which leads us to the second topic for tonight's discussion. Is it really the case that many Japanese companies truly have no coherent strategy for a closer embrace of investors, of shareholder capitalism, of independent board directors, and other elements of Western-style capitalism? Or is it the case that they simply don't have the same communication skills that they need to make themselves understood to a non-Japanese audience? And if that is the case, what is it about Japanese business organization that is leading to this outcome? Is it, for example, the lack of a history of an IR, an investor relations profession, for example? So both of tonight's speakers are ridiculously qualified to speak on these topics. In Sarah's prior position, she advised Japanese companies on how to craft and communicate strategies to the rest of the world, including several crisis situations. And Annamarie's position involves a search for answers to all of the questions we are raising here tonight. So I encourage you to read their bios online. I know they have so much to say. It's going to be a challenge to fit it all in 1 hour. So let me conclude with 2 housekeeping items. Please post your questions in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. I will do my best to get to as many of them as possible. If I can't, please email me at the conclusion of the webinar, and I will do my best to either put you in touch with either of our speakers or get you the information that you're looking for. Lastly, I would note that both speakers have asked to be off the record for the purposes of the reporters who are in the audience. There will be a replay of this discussion posted in a couple of weeks, and at that point, you're welcome to quote liberally from it at that time. But for tonight, please consider that this is off the record. So without further ado, I'd like to get started on the discussion, which is we are here to talk about what Western capitalists can learn from Japan in its 800-year-old tradition of Sampo Yoshi. And at the same time, we want to discuss how this revered philosophy might be holding back innovation and dynamism in a Japan that must now live in a global, not a local community. So I'd start by asking the first question that maybe I can ask Sarah to start off to answer first. At the most macro level, let's ask for whose benefit is the typical Japanese company run for? And by typical Japanese company, I mean, you know, an old style Keidan-ren company. How has that focus shifted at all in the decades of low economic growth? And then I'll ask Annamarie to respond to the same question.
Thanks, Alicia, and thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. I would say, just making a very broad generalization, that those companies have been largely run for customers, partners, business partners, and employees, less so for shareholders, but that there is growing, if some often reluctant recognition that that is no longer functional or is less and less functional, and that as foreign shareholders become more active and more a part of your shareholder base, that you need to pay more attention to them. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but that's my view.
And Annamarie, how would you answer that very simplistic question?
Yeah, I would answer basically the same as Sarah. On a very high level, Japanese companies, I believe, are run for stakeholders, employees, consumers, customers, the communities. And I think that one of the most interesting questions right now in Japan is how to incorporate investors into this model of business as existing to serve multiple stakeholders.
Thanks. So I'm going to ask a more substantial question now. Yeah, we also should mention that, you know, the American capitalist focus is changing as well in favor of stakeholders. And I think part of that is driven by the enormous increase in income inequality and the sensitivity that the externalities that companies that are run for profit solely are causing to the macroeconomic and the biodiversity universe writ large. But the next question I have is, can you tell me what's gone wrong with Sampo Yoshi? First, we see a really worrying increase in the number of corporate scandals, which highlights the difficulty of ensuring ethical and informed decision-making. We see breathtaking levels of gender inequality. And among these old-style companies, we see a general lack of innovation. And again, it's mostly the older Japanese companies that are facing these issues when one would expect they would be the most ardent exponents of Sampo Yoshi. So Annamarie, why don't you take a stab at that one?
What's gone wrong with Sampo Yoshi? Well,
or how has it changed? You know, how does it?
Yeah. I think that one of the biggest changes is the concept of society has got much, much, much bigger, and there's more distinct groups of stakeholders, obviously, within that group that we call society than perhaps there were in the era of the Omi merchants in the Edo period. So I think understanding all the different stakeholders within this concept of society, putting investors in that category as well, I think is something that a lot of companies are struggling with. And I think too, I'll be a little bit provocative here, but I think that one of the problems or challenges of Sampo Yoshi is the issue of accountability. If you're accountable to all society, all stakeholders, all countries, everybody, in some ways you're accountable to nobody, and that's a very, very difficult way to manage a business. So the appeal, obviously, of shareholder capitalism is one simple metric that you optimize towards. Everybody knows that's not sustainable, but at the same time, the issue of accountability, I think, is one of the great challenges or questions that need to be thought through when we can think of the future of Sampo Yoshi.
That's a great answer. But I would come back at you and say it's not just one metric, right, that the managers are held to. And that's part of the problem. That's why we're struggling here in the West, right? When you're supposed to be accountable to Black Lives Matter and the Sierra Club and your stakeholders, your shareholders, excuse me, and there's shareholders as many types, right? There's long term and there's short term. And one of the most wonderful things I ever heard a Japanese CEO say is he said, I consider myself an innkeeper. It's my job to welcome everybody. Some people will want to stay a long time. Some people will want to stay a short time, but my job is to make sure that everybody feels welcome. Sarah, how would you answer the question?
I think, I mean, I agree with what Annamarie said, but I also think the Sampo Yoshi concept is too narrow for the world that we live in. I don't think it can possibly cover the increased complexity and globalization of Japanese companies and many companies. And, for example, if Sampo Yoshi covers the seller, the buyer, and the local community, well, what about the buyer of the company? They're not even in that equation, right? So I don't think it's so much that it's gone wrong, as rather that companies have outgrown it, but have not quite come to terms with what that means and how that needs to change the way that they communicate, the way that they convey their strategy and rationale.
Can I follow on with something that Annamarie said? She was saying that it's a system which doesn't necessarily lend itself to accountability, right? And is that the biggest obstacle to change, do you think?
I think there's some other obstacles.
What would you say, Annamarie?
Accountability. Well, I think it's one of them, or knowing what to optimize towards, knowing what to focus on, knowing what the goal should be, because you have to choose and focus in any business. You can't be good for everyone all the time. So knowing where to head towards, what to optimize towards, I think is a big question. And I also think that the question of adaptability, knowing what to change, how to change, and what to keep is also, I think, a pretty salient question right now.
Yeah, I mean, the contrast that I'm looking at between GE and Hitachi, it is extraordinary that Hitachi managed to restructure itself more deeply and more quickly than GE did. So it's, again, I just want to remind everybody that we're not pointing fingers at anybody. There's good examples and bad examples on both sides. So I want to move on to the next question that I think is also interesting, which is Teikoko Databank says that there are 33,000 companies in Japan that are over 100 years old. And in the United States, there's barely a handful. And one sometimes senses this attitude in Japan that like, see, we're sustainable because we're so old. But sustainability is not simply about surviving, I suppose. Is it about contributing to global growth or innovation, or what does sustainability of the company mean in Japan?
I have a view on this. So first of all, I think it depends on what kind of company we're talking about. Are you talking about a company that's made mochi the same way for 100 years and it's an artisanal direct-to-consumer company that does one thing really, really well?
And can barely support its family, probably.
That's great. In America, we have no concept of antiquity and very little reverence for it, frankly. It's the new and the innovative that get the reverence, right? But I think that what sustainability is in that concept, Alicia, is the ability to evolve, which is something actually we talk about at SoftBank. The vision hasn't changed, but the company has constantly evolved.
Yeah, I can think of a number of Japanese companies where that's true. So moving on from that theme.
Sorry, can I add one thought to that?
Please go ahead.
Oh, versus, okay, so I gave a positive example of of an old company in Japan that's sustainable, literally. But if you're a 100-year-old company that's a conglomerate that owns a bunch of parts that don't have anything to do with each other and don't contribute to value, then that's obviously a negative example.
Yeah, yeah. Did you have anything to add, Annamarie, before we go on?
Yeah, I mean, I think on not so much the question of sustainability, but it's more of a comment on the idea of having a long-term perspective. I think that's something that Japan does very well, that when people make decisions, and I've seen this in many business contexts, the automatic or natural tendency is to think long-term. And I think that there's some really interesting research actually from London Business School showing that if in the long term you deliver value to your stakeholders, that does contribute to stronger financial performance. So I think that the long-term focus maybe is something that we can say Japan has a lot of experience or reverence for, and that may in aggregate contribute to stronger financial performance. It's a question of temporal perspective.
Well, I think it's very dependent on which company you're talking about. And I would push back on that a little bit and say it's a question of who is the long-term focus set by, right? If there's no input from outside directors, independent directors, or no input from shareholders, then there's no guarantee, right, that the long-term focus is actually the long-term focus. But to move on to slightly move on, it's the same subject really, it's governance. We were talking about this before we started, Annamarie, but I have a friend, a fund manager in Japan, David Barron, who says about ESG, he says that's nonsense. We used to just call that good management. And I remember that when Government Pension Investment Fund in Japan first put this on the map, there were many investors I talked to who had experience in Japan, who spoke Japanese, who would say ESG in Japan, it stands for Sonamama De, which for our non-Japanese speakers on the call, that means keep things the way they are. In other words, I'm old, therefore I'm sustainable. But what is it about Japanese corporate governance which has resulted in a narrowing of the definition of community? Or to put it another way, maybe that's not fair. What is it about the governance model that has resisted the expansion of the constituents, as Sarah has mentioned? What do we need to do to help the inner executive circle or the board in general understand the points of view of other people? I've heard you talk, Annamarie, about how Japanese companies can be sometimes conceived of as closed societies.
So I think one point here that's important to understand is the employment system in Japan. Post-war Japan developed a system of lifetime employment where they would hire young workers straight out of university en masse, not necessarily for the skills that they have, but for their personalities or trainability. And then workers still in Japan, this is the norm, they stay with a company for a very, very long time, for the whole careers, so 30 or 40 years. And I think that this system, it's fascinating. There are pros and cons, but I think one of the positive results of the lifetime employment system is that you develop very, very agile and adaptable people. You develop very, very strong corporate cultures, trust and affinity between people who work at the company. And I think that's a plus in a lot of ways for Japanese business. It's one of the unique things about Japanese management. But that said, it does result in future managers who have experience only in one company and maybe very, very steeped in one company culture. As great as that culture might be, sometimes it does make it, I think, a little bit more difficult to communicate persuasively to people who come from other backgrounds, whether that's people from other companies or people from other countries. I think that's one of the challenges that's thrown up as a sort of unintended result of Japan's employment system.
Sarah, I know you have a lot to say about this, but I want to come back at Annamarie with two comments. So I've looked this up, and in America, the median job tenure for men is just 4 years, whereas in the latest data I could find for Japan, which is only 2016, shows that the average length of time in a job is about 13 years. So it's a really ridiculous question to ask, well, what's the ideal length of time? It depends if you're in a fast-changing tech industry or client relationship business. But I do want to be selfish and tell you a short anecdote, which is I now live in New York City, and I become deaf to certain things that I hear all the time. But a Japanese friend of mine who's living here said he bought something at a consumer store and it was defective. So he goes back to the store and he finds somebody who's working there to try to help him. And the person says to him, "I'm sorry, I can't help you. I only work here." And, it's something I hear all the time that I never thought about. And what does that mean? It means I don't feel any loyalty to my company because they don't feel any loyalty to me, and I don't expect to be here very long, and they're not training me. But let's hear what you have to react to in this conversation, Sarah. I just love that. I only work here.
That's hilarious. So many things to react to. One is just on the employee point. I do think it's ironic that that even as the reliance, I would say, or the certainty of lifetime employment is starting to recede in Japan at the same time that employers in the US have become very sensitive to pressure from communication, the need to communicate better with employees. I mean, look at places like Facebook or Google where you have employee walkouts, right, over company policy. That's a huge concern now for executives that did not exist, I would say, 20 years ago. I did want to go back, though, to what Annamarie mentioned, and I know we were talking about earlier about persuasion. And I think this is the biggest, maybe internal/cultural hurdle that Japanese companies need to and can overcome. And this was actually the fun part for me when I was working as a consultant for Japanese companies, is helping people see the difference between speaking to an audience, that a homogenous audience that knows you very well and shares your expectations, versus another that does not, whether those are overseas customers, shareholders, regulators. And that I think that Japanese companies have underdeveloped persuasive muscles, the art of persuasion. They're used to repeating and giving a lot of detail and very detailed presentations and laying out strategy, but that's different from persuading. And if you have a compliant constituency and you haven't been challenged, then you haven't developed that muscle, right? Whereas I think that's very different than in the US, where we're used to that and we're just a more combative, I would say, culture. And there are downsides to that, as we all know too well. But I was just thinking to myself that I think is, and we can talk more about this, about how do you, what's the fix for that? But I think that does hold companies back. And I also think it's something that can be worked on. I've seen it happen.
Yeah, I know that Annamarie has a few really interesting things to say about this, but I want to jump in again for a minute and say, I think that Japanese companies are very bad at bragging, right? Or even making factual claims about how good they are. And I worked with an investment banker a Japanese investment banker, who saw this as a gold mine. And he found that there were many Japanese brands which should be the global standard, but were not. And so what did he do? He tried to sell them off to Chinese companies. And in one case, he was successful. It was Honma Golf, which was, I'm not a golfer, but I understand they are the gold standard. And, he just figured that another culture would be better at not being shy to say this is the best product in the world. But Annamarie, you said something really interesting about how in Japan, just laying out the facts, is tantamount to strategy, and you expect people to understand. Could you go back and say that again?
Yeah, so this is maybe a little bit of an abstract point about different communication styles, I guess, but the general approach or register or discourse in Japan to communicate strategy is to give really good, solid, detailed, and accurate information to your listener, and then trust the listener that he or she is going to pull out what the stories that he or she needs to know. And that very sort of solicitous or humble approach of service through information and trusting your listener to pull out the stories that he or she needs, works, I think, really well in Japan. And if you've ever worked at a Japanese company, you will know that when you're making a presentation to somebody important, somebody that you need to sign off on something or understand something, you will have maybe like 10 or 20 slides for the actual presentation. And then you'll have like 100 just in case slides with all the information you might possibly need to answer any question. And I see you're totally nodding your heads here. But that's an approach that I think is just based in respect for the listener, trusting them to make their own conclusions. It is an approach that does not travel across the Pacific Ocean very well, or the Eurasian continent, I guess we can say. So I think that if Japanese companies get stuck in just taking materials that they would have prepared or have prepared for Japanese audiences, putting them just into English and going about the communication in the same way, things fall flat. And from a Western perspective, it seems like the company has lots and lots of information and no strategy, when in fact, I think that's not the case.
That's a really interesting and important point, I think, that is not generally well understood. There's a couple of questions here in the chat box about CEO compensation and the incentives of CEOs to do a good job. And I know that you're not entirely comfortable about talking about this, Annamarie, but I think you can probably chime in with the things about incentives. It is striking to me, I work for an activist and I do work with a lot of activists, and a lot of shareholder proposals are about, in a sense, increasing CEO pay. They want CEOs to get paid more in Japan, and particularly when it's tied to your point, Annamarie, long-term outcomes. So stock-based compensation, whether it's tied to something as simple as the stock price or profitability or various ESG goals. These investors want the CEOs to make more money for doing a good job. And it seems to be there's a tremendous amount of resistance against this. Do either of you want to speak to why that might be so?
You know, I'm thinking of a comment that a wise friend of mine once made. We were talking about, I won't say which it was you know, a media company doing a CEO, sort of one of these CEO conferences in Japan, and the whole idea of CEO networking. And I was talking to a friend who'd worked in Japan for years. He said, well, first of all, it's kind of odd because people already network through the Keidanen and all these other associations, number one. And he said, second of all, a CEO, your typical Japanese CEO, might have more in common with the janitor at his company than a CEO of an unrelated company. And I thought, you know, he's right about that. So I'm just throwing that out there in terms of incentivization and who you identify with.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing? That he identifies more with the janitor of his own company?
I think that it certainly shows some cohesion in that sense of the company as a family, and maybe not wanting to distance yourself too much and to not wanting to stick out too much from that, right?
Right.
I'm just guessing.
I was having a conversation with somebody who is on the compensation committee of a big company, and this discussion about increasing CEO bonus, you know, tied to various performance indicators came up, and the consensus of opinion seemed to be we would only increase the CEO pay if everybody's pay was increased. And, you know, again, that is such a different attitude from what we see in most other places. And again, do you have any reaction to that, Annamarie? Do you think it's a good thing, a bad thing? Does it have unintended consequences?
So, I mean, I can't comment directly on CEO performance or CEO compensation exactly, but it's more of a comment on the importance of, it's a very academic phrase, but firm-specific knowledge in Japanese management. So like Sarah said, the CEO of a Japanese company, usually it's an inside, somebody who joined the company out of university and built his whole career. And he will have, almost always he will have a network of people and called a doki, people who entered the company at the same time, and they've gone through a lot of things together, and they've worked and, you know, supported each other and built the company. And so, yeah, the CEO, it's occupied by one person, but it's very, very much a team sport in Japan. And so I think this sense of gratitude to your peers for their support and this idea that it's a team sport rather than one sort of professional, Japanese word is pro-keisha, or professional manager, this sense of solidarity or mutual support or gratitude, I guess, maybe is one of the reasons why it's difficult for people to accept or understand why you would want to pay one person a lot more than people who are just maybe one level down.
Well, to turn one of your comments back on you, I'm sorry, doesn't that speak to the lack of accountability? I mean, if you're paying somebody big bucks, they are clearly accountable. Whereas everybody is making kind of the same, it's like nobody's really taking the fall for anything, right?
That's a fair point. I think that the idea of making one person accountable versus group accountability is one of the big sort of questions or sources of misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Between Western and Japanese.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think I was just thinking too that that in Japanese companies versus Western companies, the concept of professionalization is so different. I remember being surprised when I first started advising Japanese companies, and I would find somebody in leading communications was just rotating through from legal or IR, and so there was much less of a sense of those very sort of developed professional roles. Now, again, this is sort of more traditional Japanese companies, so I'm sure that's changed.
Yeah, it's astounding to me that to this day, most Japanese companies don't have job descriptions, right? Particularly for what does a CFO do? I mean, there's a whole consulting industry in Japan on that, right? To try to answer that question. Okay. But again, Annamarie, you're talking about, the CEO comes up from the ranks. There's advantages to that, which you have pointed out. I would make the point that, I've talked to one CEO in Japan who was brought in from the outside, not once, but twice. So both times he was running a Japanese company and he was called in from outside that company. And I said to him, how'd you learn about your company? Like, how did you find out who was the best person to talk to and, what bodies were buried where? And he said, I had to ask people outside the company, right? It seems like in Japan, it's really hard to do an organ transplant. Right? It's like the body will reject it more often than not. But here too in America, we're guilty of that, right? I remember that when Jamie Dimon moved over to JP Morgan, he took a team of like 20 of his most senior deputies from Citi over to JP Morgan. So it's and I've seen this in companies I've worked with too. I mean, the senior guy gets hired from Goldman or Morgan or whatever, and he makes sure that he brings a couple of his people over with him. So there's maybe these two systems are not quite as different as we think. But do you think that, I mean, getting back to this argument about CEO pay being tied to something about the share price, whether it's any kind of KPI, can you make an argument that CEO and Japanese management's interests can be aligned with investors' interest if they have no exposure to the share price?
No, I think it should be. I remember once being in a meeting. This was with I would say a very sophisticated media outlet and a CEO of a very large company in the U.S. We were meeting with the editorial board. It was to persuade them of the merits of the transaction. And one of the senior editors said, "Do you ever feel pressure from shareholders?" And afterwards he said, "That is the stupidest question I've ever received. Of course I do, as I should." So, I mean, I think it's difficult to create that unless you have some link to your company's, some very measurable link to performance, and what better than share price.
Yeah, a lot of Japanese companies who do pay their CEOs some small portion, particularly if they're in regulated industries like financial, they can't tell me the share price or even how many shares they own. So that's not being an incentive in the way that it's practiced at the current time anyway. We have a question here that I think maybe Annamarie may be interested in, which is it's Mr. Stephen Baum, and he says, the panelists assert that Japanese firms have been largely run for customers and business partners, stakeholders, but with high levels of cross-shareholding, this is in fact shareholder capitalism. And how does this change as cross-shareholdings are reduced? So do you want to pick that one up, Annamarie?
Ooh, that's a good point. It's a good way to say that if your shareholders are your customers, then maybe it is shareholder capitalism. I think that one of the issues, I guess, that is often cited when people talk about cross-shareholding in Japan is that it impedes capital markets from efficiently allocating capital, that people are making decisions to buy or sell equities based on factors other than, the business's performance. And so I guess it's a question of what do you think the function of capital markets are? If it's to efficiently allocate capital, then cross-shareholding is something that impedes the functioning of that system. On the other hand, if your shareholders are your customers, then maybe we can say that it's shareholder capitalism. It's a question of what you think shareholder capitalism exists for, I guess.
Well, I think the classical argument against Japanese cross-shareholding is to say those shares are not held for investment purposes. And in fact, they're illegal, right? Because to hold shares in another company for the purposes of securing a better deal is illegal under Japanese law. But I would argue that cross-shareholding does, to the extent that it exists to allow the management to corral enough yes votes, that does impede a lot of things, not just efficient capital allocation, but the dynamism and the innovation and the globalization of Japanese management. And to Sarah's point, there are examples in the West where we have dual class shares, which are meant to give startups enough time to get up and running before the wild forces of rabid capitalism are unleashed on them. So again, I think this is a point in the conversation where you can say both sides, right? Both sides, yes, both sides, no.
Well, point of view on that one. So two things. One, another anecdote on the question of cross-shareholding. In one case, we had a client, it was an activist situation when we were going through the various points on which we were pushing back. The explanation for cross-shareholding was that these are necessary for business relationships. And our counter was, well, the question you'll get, because we've already had that question from me, is why do you need to own one another's shares to have a business relationship? Why can't you have one without that? And we actually had quite a heated debate over this, where we finally said, they said, we understand, but we want you to say that anyway. And we said, but it will not work. So why don't we actually push back on other points where we feel you have much more ability to persuade, because that one is not going to work. So that's just one point. The second thing is, I think the focus on cross-shareholding in the sort of, literal sense is just overlooks a point that your friend Ken Hokugo has made really well, Alicia, in his discussion of allegiant shareholders. So it's not just companies owning one another's shares, but companies, that court shareholders to be for the purpose of being yes men. And that is, I would argue that is not really shareholder capitalism at all, and that impedes the flow of information and to the point that you were making earlier, accountability.
Yeah. No, I'm totally on board with you, and Ken is a friend of mine, and I'm on his side. We have a bunch of more questions. Here's a really kind of interesting question. Maybe I'll toss this at you, Annamarie. Somebody who in the audience says, where do you think most Japanese long-term perspective as a natural tendency, as a natural default comes from? Is it the farming culture? Is it being an island? Is it a religion? Or what's up with the long-term thinking?
Oh, that's such a great question. I will not be able to answer it to the question asker's satisfaction. I personally do not like cultural explanations. I do not like it when people say, oh, it's just Japanese culture, because, well, first, culture doesn't explain anything. If you say Japanese people do this because they're Japanese, that's a circular argument. And second, culture changes. Japan is a very different place 30 years ago than it is today, and the same as any country in the world. So I don't want to go for a cultural explanation. And also sometimes people cite geography. They go sort of geographical determinism, that Japan has typhoons, Japan has earthquakes, we have to collaborate and whatever. I don't think that's the whole story either. I just think that every country has its own historical contingencies, and things develop for a lot of different reasons that are impossible to really make grand theory out of. But I do think that Japan's experience of pre-war and post-war, the occupation and the dramatic changes that were made to Japan's business and employment systems in the post-war period, I think do explain the long-term thinking in Japan. But this is a whole other webinar. I don't think I've answered that question satisfactorily.
I think you answered it perfectly earlier, which is the lifetime employment system, is all about keeping us all together in one company forever, right? And keeping our friends who are coming up behind us in the same company forever. It's the illiquidity of the labor force, I think, that lends itself to this long-term one company kind of way of thinking. And
can I just add something on the employment system there, though? So I don't want to be like the biggest fan of Japan's lifetime employment system, but I think it's important to remember that it developed after the war as a way to make Japanese companies innovative and agile. And the bargain that was struck is that workers would give, long working hours to the company. They would promise to work anywhere in any job. In return for lifetime employment security. And that worked for a long time. When certain conditions were in place, that worked. And I think it did help Japanese companies develop really agile people through job rotation. They had a really flexible workforce. And then in return, workers had, essentially social welfare. They were guaranteed never to be fired and basically still are. And that provided welfare security for lots and lots of Japanese households. And the government didn't have to directly spend on social welfare. So at the time, it was a great system that I think really contributed to innovation and agility in Japan. But the external conditions have changed, the macro environment has changed, but the system has remained the same, past its sell-by date.
I think it also affects communication, because we talked earlier about how Japanese companies, the prevalence of a corporate philosophy in Japan, which can then give birth to a credo or a way, right? Yeah. Which is a much easier concept to understand in a system of lifetime employment, but which comes off very odd, I think, or it's just hard to translate overseas.
Yeah, I have a question from somebody I'm delighted to see on this question board, Catherine Sasanuma. And she says, in the week of International Women's Day, can you comment on progress in gender equality in general? How can Japan make progress? What are the challenges, and are there any signs of hope? And I'm going to be really selfish and jump in and say, as I said to you guys, I think diversity, and we were talking about this, Catherine, before we started, diversity is something different in Japan than it is elsewhere in the world. And I'm very upset that a lot of ESG disclosure is going to be based on a Western definition of diversity. I think there's plenty of diversity in Japan if you define it as diversity of thought. And my problem is that people don't speak up. But could you guys address the question that Catherine is specifically answering about gender equality? What's your level of optimism?
Well, first I will say that gender equality in the professional workforce in Japan is atrocious, and there's a lot of work to be done. And whether gender diversity is a global standard or whatever, there's a lot of work that has to be done in Japan on gender diversity. I think that, the employment system is a huge factor in that, because of regular employees in Japan, women are only minority. It's, I think, 60% men or something like that. So even if you promote every single regular female employee in your company to leadership, you will not hit 50%. And companies can only control what they do with their own workers. Structural factors, it's going to require a political fix.
Yeah. By the way, just for the benefit of our viewers, when you say regular workers, you're talking about the two-tier system. So you might want to just say something.
Sorry. Yeah. So Japan has one of the most segmented markets in the OECD. There's essentially two categories of worker. One is regular or seishain, and these are the unfireable lifetime employment people. The other category is irregular workers, and that's part-time, contract, self-employed people with comparatively lower pay and essentially no chance to proceed into management ranks at companies.
Right, and therefore no commitment to go wherever the company sends you.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of women don't choose that first category.
Yeah.
Right. You have anything to add, Sarah?
No, I mean, I was just thinking of SoftBank. It's been encouraging to have a woman join the board who's an expert on corporate governance.
Yeah,
number one.
Sarah. She's a former colleague of mine.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
And then secondly, and this is totally anecdotal, but I was heartened just when I was on the consulting side that a number of the Japanese companies I came across, the heads of IR were women. Now, not necessarily higher up in management, but I was not the only woman in the room, often, but not always. So I guess I'm cautiously optimistic, but recognizing, as Annamarie said, that there are massive barriers to overcome.
Yeah.
Yep.
You know, you mentioned IR, and it's my observation that to the extent that there are women in positions, it tends to be these kind of communication things like IR, or either that or ESG. And that's true in America as well.
Yes,
You know,
it
the
is.
ranks of the ESG professionals are mostly women. And I don't quite know what's up with that. But again, on the point of view of diversity in Japan, you know, I think we should talk about age diversity as well as gender diversity. And as I said, diversity of thought. I'd be curious whether both of you have any comments on socioeconomic diversity. Because what I'm always told about Japan is because Japan's educational system is so open and based on merit, that unless you go to one of the top universities, probably you're not top quality, right? Here in America, there's all kinds of reasons why people cannot go to Ivy League schools, whether it's money or inability to move or whatever, right? But it's true that I did this exercise last year looking at the 100 CEOs of the top Japanese top market cap companies. They were all from Todai, Kyodai, Hitotsubashi, Waseda, and Keio, and that's it. So do you think there is this problem with socioeconomic diversity in Japan, or is it not really an issue?
Yeah, so just, sorry, just pushing back on your comment, the Japanese university system is open. In one sense, yes, because it's decided by your performance on the entrance exam. On the other hand, the average family income, I think, of students at elite universities in Japan is much, much higher than the average. And so I think that access to elite institutions, it's still easier for people who come from families with higher incomes.
Is that because families with higher income have the money to pay for juku and, you know, other kinds of training to get into the, okay.
Yeah. I
But
was
I'm
going to say
struck
something
by-
similar about elitism, but also I work for a company where the CEO went to Berkeley.
Right.
So,
Berkeley's elite.
he did it the hard way. He did it the hard way.
Okay. But I'm also, you know, you can't read very many articles about the current prime minister, Suga, without encountering some discussion about he came up hard, right? You know, he came up without all this privilege. So there must be some degree of socioeconomic diversity in Japan, I guess. And I'm glad that it's appreciated. I want to turn, we have some time. I want to turn to something I know that you have lots of experience in Japan, Sarah, but I'm sure that Annamarie has some comments as well, which is when we look at how Japanese companies and even the government react to crises, I think it's safe to say that it's not one of their strongest points. I mean, particularly in communication, right? When I think of some of the problems that Japanese companies have faced in America, whether it be product liability, or when we talk about, for example, you know, social crises like sexual harassment. There was a big case in America, right? And things like investment in Myanmar. It's like when there is something horrible that appears out of nowhere, it seems that Japanese companies struggle to react and to communicate.
I think that comes with the need to build a consensus around the course of action to take. And I had a client once in a difficult situation, and they said, we would like to have every possible scenario. We would like you to list every possible scenario and the responses in each of those scenarios. And I remember sitting and sort of looking around thinking I could paper the walls with scenarios and it probably still wouldn't be enough. And I think it's this very understandable desire to feel control, that you have control over the situation by mapping it out and making sure that you've covered every aspect, where sometimes you just need, you know, speed of action. And I have also seen situations at my alma mater, where we very successfully counseled Japanese companies with crises. And in that case, it was, for example, with a relationship with the CEO, or you needed to have an individual to be able to build consensus to move quickly.
Okay, let me give you a couple of examples that I can ask Annamarie to comment on. I think we can all agree, I'm going to talk about the government now rather than companies because that's sometimes difficult, but the government really thought it was acting in good faith when it took a roadshow about the new foreign exchange law out to the rest of the world. And similarly, when the Tokyo Stock Exchange introduced or announced its proposals to reform, it's like all hell broke loose. All hell broke loose. All the foreigners were completely confused, felt that the Japanese government wasn't listening to them, wasn't understanding their questions. And I think that there were some lessons learned, but it seems to me that happens more often than not. So Annamarie, can I give you an opportunity to react to that if you would like to? I see that Sarah's shaking her head, so she probably has something to say, but go ahead, Annamarie first.
Can I hear what Sarah has to say first? I would love to hear what Sarah thinks.
I just think that just sounds like, I'm thinking of what you would do in an ideal world is you would communicate on background with key constituents about the changes that are coming their way, so that people are not blindsided, because businesses don't like uncertainty and unpleasant surprises, especially when those two occur in tandem.
Yeah, I'm glad you used that phrase. I think I've told you this story. My very first Japanese teacher, who was a translator, professionally poetry translator, told me he had never figured out a good way to translate the English expression pleasant surprise. We have a really backhanded compliment in the chat box here. Mr. Berkeley Scott says, I feel I've seen this identical conversation over and over again during the past 3 decades, except perhaps in the past it would have been 3 men giving this webinar. Having the 3 of you lead this discussion is a wonderful and refreshing change. However, fundamentally, I feel real change has been elusive. Have I missed anything? I feel very strongly about this, but Annamarie, why don't I let you go first?
So 30 years ago, I was thinking about very different things. So I don't have the long-term historical perspective on this. I do think just on the question of change in Japan, and this is something it fascinates me. So I'm a cultural anthropologist by background. So I'm just fascinated by social change and how people's values change over time. I think that in Japan, things change very, 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 very slowly and then all at once. I think that the concept of turning point, maybe it's just easier to see when you're from an outsider position, but I think that the idea of there will be a turning point pretty soon in Japan in a number of domains. And I think that investor relations, shareholder engagement is going to be one of them. And I think that diversity, gender equality particularly, but diversity in general is going to be the second sort of tipping point. And maybe we have another webinar like 3-4 years from now and see if I'm correct. But I think that it's coming soon. I think that change has been slowly building. And I think that Japan is close to a tipping point. This is my personal reflection.
What do you think, Sarah?
What do you think, Alicia? I want to hear your view, because you said you have
I would push back on this idea that nothing has changed. I mean, we can argue about whether it's changing fast enough relative to the rest of the world, but I think there's been an enormous change in the understanding. I think you referred to this, Sarah, the understanding of Japanese management that whether they like it or not, they have to be accountable. They have to respond to outsiders, whether they're domestic or Japanese, who are asking tough questions. One of the nastiest by that, I mean, aggressive activists in Japan, a guy who calls up the company he's invested in every morning and says, I expect you to share all your cross shareholdings by tomorrow. I mean, we're talking about this kind of activist. He's Japanese, right? So I think that when you see the interaction between investors and their companies, whether they're foreign investors or Japanese investors, they're much more demanding. I think Japanese managers are understanding they have to be more proactive, not just reactive. And so are the employees, right? And some of the social movements that you see in Japan, like help me out here. There was that woman who created a blog that Abe had to respond to about no childcare in Japan.
Yeah.
Going to wear heels in the office.
Right, no bills in
Yeah.
the office. I think there's plenty of these examples. So I don't think I've met Mr. Scott, but I would push back on him a little bit. It's true that perhaps the pace of change is could be faster, but to Anne-Marie's point, I think it can happen really quickly when the time is right.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think social media plays, social media has played a role in both of those examples that we just talked about. That didn't exist 30 years ago to that point.
Yeah, we have so many questions here and so many of them are so good. We've only got 5 more minutes, so I'm just going to read out 1 or 2. And for the people whose questions we don't get to, please feel free to email me and I can either put you in touch with our speakers or I can try to get you the information that you're looking for. But let's see. It's so hard to decide. I'm going to go back to one of my questions that I asked you guys earlier because I know you have a lot to say about this. We talked about, and when we talk about ESG, sometimes there's a sense that, particularly on ESG, that this is more of a compliance than strategy. And we talked about what is the difference between compliance and strategy in general. Do you think that's a fair comment that sometimes, particularly when it, as regards public information, that the Japanese are just complying rather than embracing this as a way to devise strategy? Could I ask you to react to that, Annamarie?
Well, yeah. So first, I think, ESG as a box ticking exercise happens outside of Japan as well. I think that it's a framework that people are trying to get used to. And so I think like step 1 for a lot of companies is first, we'll just disclose what we have to, we'll check the boxes, and then we'll figure out, a unique and strategy for ESG that's unique to us. And there's, different Japanese companies have progressed in different ways, and some Japanese companies have really amazing proactive ESG strategies. But just on the question of strategy communication in general, I think that compliance is basically showing that you do no harm, right? And strategy, at least as I understand it, is showing what good you're doing, why you should exist, why people should invest in you. And I think when Japanese companies try to explain what good they're doing or what they want to bring to the world, why they exist or why they should exist, it's very, very high level. It's very abstract. It's almost on the level of, it is the level of sort of vision or dream. And that's an accepted way to communicate your strategy in Japanese. We've all seen, though, I think Japanese companies, when they try to communicate, whether it's their corporate philosophy or their corporate strategy, when you turn it into English, it sometimes sounds almost close to nonsense. Something like we'll bring joy and happiness to the world through high quality semiconductor wafers. It makes sense. The logic is there. If you read it in Japanese and you talk to the managers, some of these are really great visions that are totally worth investing in. Communicating it, transferring that logic or that way of thinking or that orientation from Japanese to English is a really hard task. And I think it's going to require a lot more specialist talent than is currently being cultivated in Japanese companies.
Which is an argument for specialization instead of generalization against the lifetime employment system, I would say. But Sarah, why don't you?
Well, it will also requires, you're right, Annamarie, you've got like this very high concept up here and then a ton of detail down below. But what you need is a bridge. What you need is selective communication, right? And it also is related to what you said, Alicia, about being accountable. If everything is on the table, then nobody knows what to prioritize, what to choose from. So you've got to communicate more selectively and more persuasively about your reason for existing and your benefit to society and other stakeholders. Laundry lists are not persuasive. But a sort of strategic narrative can be very persuasive.
Okay, so we've got 1 minute left. So, at the bottom, the reason we got this started was talking about the difficulty of Japanese companies explaining their purpose, explaining their strategy, explaining their leadership to the rest of the world, and hearing what the rest of the world has to say about that by making themselves more open and vulnerable. So one of the things that, and the fact that Annamarie has her job and her job title, to me is a sign that things are changing. In your world, Sarah, I mean, one of the things that worries me is that IR is not a profession, and investor relations is not seen as being strategically important. It's not, you know, maybe they report to the CFO, maybe they report to accounting, but it's important that senior management hears what the outside world thinks about them. How do you see that changing, if at all?
I completely agree with you. And it's hard for me to speak generally because I don't think I've gotten a close enough view inside multiple IR departments at other Japanese companies. But I would like to hope that as Japanese companies globalize, because they have to, they're not going to have a choice. And especially as the presence of foreign shareholders increases, that there's nowhere to hide. And the sort of ways, the sort of tried and tested ways that you're comfortable with in Japan just aren't going to work with vocal Western shareholders. So I think at some point, similar to what Annamarie was saying earlier, that it will change, and maybe it's slower than you would like, but it's already not exactly as it was 30 years ago.
Yeah, and again, to reiterate something that I pointed on, I think it's very hopeful that the Japanese are having these fights internally, right? So you see record numbers of hostile TOBs and so on.
Yep.
And so forth. We've run out of time, and I want to thank you both. It's really been great. It's been so interesting, and I hope our audience appreciated it. There were 25 questions. I didn't even have time to read them all. So I honestly want to make the offer to anybody whose question I didn't get to. Please reach out to me by email, and I will either put you in touch with the speakers or get you the information that you're looking for on my own. So please thank Sarah and Annamarie for their time tonight. And I hope the people in Japan have a good day and a good evening to everybody in New York. I would like to take this opportunity now. I want to thank all of our sponsors, not only for their financial support, which is incredibly important, but also for their friendship and their ability, their generosity in serving as advisors and sources of information and network for us. So please show your appreciation to them as we do. Thank you very much for your participation tonight, and I will look forward to seeing you at another one soon. Thank you.